Thank you so much. Thanks so much to the event organizers, especially Inga, for inviting me. I am delighted to be here. I'm really sorry I couldn't be here in person because I was really looking forward to talking about all these ideas with other people outside my apartment, but alas. So I am not going to be talking about the far right or online radicalization today. It's actually kind of nice for me to take a little break from that, which is what I've been doing for the last year and a half. Instead, I'm going to be sharing some work that came out last year on harassment and a little sneak preview of my next book on privacy called The Private is Political that ideally is coming out this time next year, but we will see. A lot of these, really, this slide deck is not, it's mostly just like pictures of things. It's not, there's not a lot of text. It's just to kind of illustrate my ideas. So in general, in my work, I've been fascinated by how social media has transformed attention, specifically how people adapt to having large audiences that are made possible by social media. Most of us will probably never find much of an audience, but the internet has made a really profound difference to how we manage the audiences that we do have. If you think about it, before widespread internet use, really only celebrities or politicians had to deal with the impacts of living life in a public way. But not only did they have access to managers and assistants and bodyguards, there were far fewer media outlets, and they were strongly gate-kept. So today, few of us have these protections, and instead we really struggle to choose what to share and with who and when. In our face-to-face lives, we often can keep our audiences separate. We can talk frankly with our friends or with our partner. We carefully decide what we're going to share with our teachers or our students about our personal lives. We can be silly with our kids, but serious at work. But whether we can keep these disparate audiences separate is deeply compromised by technologies that not only flatten complex relationships into friends or followers, a phenomenon Dana Boyd and I call context collapse, but technologies that are, as Wendy Chun argues, leaky by design. On large sites like Facebook or Instagram, our stories and updates are viewed from people from all areas of our lives, from people we might have gone to high school with 20 or 30 years ago, to conference acquaintances, people who might know us from very different contexts. But social media is designed to facilitate that type of sharing. It makes it easy, even seamless, for information to spread across these networks. This is great if we're seeking that wide attention, but it can be very stressful and even scary in other situations. We live in an attention economy where what is valued by people, companies, and algorithms is what can command attention. This has transformed journalism as outlets compete for clicks and editors commission stories they know will perform well on Facebook. It has transformed politics as politicians from Donald Trump to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez create and maintain effective ties with their constituents using social media. It has transformed entertainment as ingenues are now cast for their Instagram followings, and pop stars like Lil Nas X optimize their songs for TikTok and Spotify. And it has transformed how we think about ourselves, our online presences, and our relationships with others, all of which are mediated by technologies like Facebook, Twitter, WhatsApp, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Slack. We seek attention, but with this attention comes pitfalls. So I'm interested in the public and the private as the two sides of the coin of online attention. The public is what we share with others. It's what is visible. The private is what we choose either to keep secret or only to ourselves or share within a particular context or a specific group of people. And today I want to talk about these transformations in the context of social media. First, how social media has transformed privacy. And second, how seeking an audience, how seeking publicity and attention, especially for academics, can make us very vulnerable, not just to harassment, as we just heard, but also just to judgment in general. Network privacy. So this is the topic of the new book. Privacy is an essential human right, but our ability to control our own information is challenged by network technologies. We live in an era of networked privacy where technologies and norms have not caught up with the challenges brought by social media and big data. But this loss of privacy can have very intense consequences. So consider someone like Kim Kardashian. She has a full-time staff, billions of dollars, and a social media management team, and she is currently dealing with a very messy divorce that is playing out in public as her ex-husband drags her new boyfriend, her kids, and her parenting on Instagram while flaunting lookalike girlfriends for strategically staged paparazzi photo shoot. Kim has made her immense fortune, like many celebrities, by sharing her personal life, first on cable television and then on social media. But she has no ability to control what Kanye West says about her in public. Like many vengeful exes, he is weaponizing publicity to humiliate her. This, of course, is amplified by the fame of the people involved and the large engaged audience eager to gobble up the story as it is covered by highbrow and lowbrow media outlets alike. But this also shows the networked nature of privacy. Social media takes our self-presentation and how we share information with others out of our control. We must manage the tidbits about ourselves that are spilled by others while carefully attending to our own online presence. So I want to use a more down-to-earth example from my own field work. And I want to talk about how this ability to control information is specifically compromised by the affordances of network technologies because they are designed to connect audiences, but they completely fail to attend to how these audiences may have very different norms and values. So I spoke with Aria, who, when I talked with her, was a 32-year-old medical student from a devout Midwestern Muslim family. And she told me about something that had happened to her in high school. Her friends tagged her in a Facebook picture of some of their friends at a bar. She wasn't in the picture. She had never been in a bar. She was simply tagged in the picture by a friend. Her family, however, considered the association with alcohol entirely inappropriate for a Muslim woman. This belief was so strong that she was forced by her family to change schools to get away from a bad influence, the person who tagged her. In this case, inaccurate information about Aria spread through her social network and to her familial and religious networks, causing significant conflict between the cultural norms of her secular friends and her religious parents. To her friends, tagging her was no big deal. She wasn't in the picture. It was just kind of a joke. But they didn't share the norms that her parents did, and they didn't understand how these norms would affect Aria. To avoid these situations, we engage in what I call privacy work, the ongoing actions, decisions, and undertakings that people do to achieve their desired level of privacy. We all do privacy work, and this is everything from, like, you close your blinds if you're getting undressed at night, you might have a password manager, you might use a VPN, or you might just cover your hand when you're entering your PIN number at the ATM. But it's also important to understand that these strategies and this amount of labor is unequally distributed, with the wealthy and tech savvy having more options, but marginalized people often needing more privacy protection. Even Kim Kardashian, as much as she shares of her life, still engages in privacy work. But the stakes are much lower for her than they might be, for example, for an undocumented immigrant worried about being doxxed. So I did talk to a couple of undocumented people when I was doing field work, and one of them told me about a WhatsApp group that he had with other undocumented people where they told each other about where ICE raids were going to be so that they sort of could coordinate that they wouldn't be in that area at the time or they wouldn't go to work that day. And so that's a type of privacy work that we might see being done by a more marginalized population. But I also want to turn and talk about what the stakes are for us as academics, which is something I'm also very interested in. Because I think that for academics, seeking attention can very much be a double-edged sword. Many of us take to social media. My favorite social media in the past was Twitter. I know I'm a little less on Twitter than I used to be, but I was very on Twitter at one point. My first book was about Twitter. I would say I met many of my academic colleagues on Twitter. It was kind of my bread and butter for a long period of time. And I think there's a lot of other people who still engage in spaces like academic Twitter to connect with colleagues, to learn about works in progress, and to promote our scholarship. And I think this has been especially difficult during COVID, since we've lost out on so much of the kind of in-person conferencing and networking that is often like one of the best things about our profession. But our profession also tends to use metrics like citation counts and journal impact factors as a stand-in for quality. And this means that other metrics, like the ability to attract attention, can also be a considerable advantage. There's a star system in academia, which has been well documented by other scholars, in which you have a rarefied few who receive a disproportionate share of attention, while there's this many deserving others who are sort of toiling in precarity. And this is definitely reinforced by the logics of social media, which facilitate the creation of micro celebrities in every niche and subculture. So, there's academic celebrities, there's food celebrities, there's, probably pet care celebrities for all I know. Social media is also in some ways an ideal space in which to seek attention, whether to engage in public scholarship and potentially increase the impact of one's research, or simply to establish your significance with the goal of high status signifiers like press attention or keynote invitations. However, as my UNC colleague Tressie McMillan Cottom writes, seeking attention for attention's sake emphasizes, quote, brand building as opposed to consciousness raising, brand awareness as opposed to co-creation of knowledge. It can also engender suspicion in one's colleagues, as there's a sense that time that you're spending talking to reporters or prepping your TED Talk is taking away from time spent doing difficult, mentally taxing research. But the value of public scholarship is undeniable. Our Twitter accounts, YouTube videos, or free publicly available white papers may reach far more people and have much more impact than any type of scholarly output, no matter how rigorous. A few years ago, I did like this dumb Facebook video. It was for one of these kind of like content shops where they have a bunch of like millennials and Gen Zers making videos for Facebook. And they asked me to come talk about this movie, The Circle, that was based on the Dave Eggers novel, which is actually like a really good dystopian satire of social media. I really didn't want to do this, but I did it. And that video got like 10 million views. Now, granted, we know years later that Facebook inflated all their video counts, so who knows how many people actually watched it. But the point is, there is no way that 10 million people will ever read or see anything else that I've done. So when you think about the scope and scale of these types of things, public scholarship is the best way to reach out to these larger audiences. And this is especially true when some of our best work is siloed in chapters of books that cost $100 each, or journals that charge $35 for a single article, not a cent of which we get ourselves. And these are very inaccessible to anyone outside the academy, and they're inaccessible to a lot of people in the academy as well. But the ability to translate our research into things like sound bites or tweets or even op-eds is a skill, and it's not a skill that everyone has. And so ideally, in an ideal world, social media would give us that ability, right? To translate our ideas to people who maybe can use them to impact the world, like policymakers or technologists or activists. If we don't do this, we cede this turf to reporters, entrepreneurs, or at worst, behavioral economists. As these logics of self-branding and attention-seeking trickle down the academic job ladder, though, we face two significant implications. First, as Joe touched on, publicity can easily be weaponized against any academic, but especially those engaging in what we call risky research. Scholarship on the far right, or COVID, or climate change, or trans issues can easily be removed from its disciplinary context and held up for ridicule or harassment by individuals or organizations who disagree with its premises. And unfortunately, harassment is a technique that is used by people across the political spectrum. And falling afar of people with liberal or leftist ideas can and does also result in harassment. Universities are often completely unprepared to deal with this kind of thing, and they often fail to protect researchers, especially graduate students and untenured faculty, from these kinds of attacks. And second, while many junior faculty are often advised to engage in self-branding, given the uncertainties of the job market, I think this can undermine your ability to be seen as a serious scholar. And this is especially true the further one falls from the white male ideal of the professorate, because that means that it's going to require more rigorous self-censorship for you to uphold an acceptable academic persona. Attention has upsides, but it also has significant risks. And these risks, again, are unequally distributed. So let's start with unwanted attention. I think many of us go into research because we have the desire to create concrete change in the world. Like we have, maybe an activist sensibility, or we want to see something change. But this often requires putting your work in front of a much larger audience than your dissertation advisor or your tenure committee. And this opens you up to larger amounts of criticism. And I think most of us are happy to hear reasoned critique, but that's very different from the systematic use of attention to shut down specific viewpoints and voices. So networked harassment, which I wrote about in a paper that came out in Social Media and Society last summer, that's open access. It's a technique that's used by groups across the political spectrum in which coordinated attacks against individuals are organized and amplified through social media. And in my research, I wrote about how much of this harassment is morally motivated. In other words, people think that harassing the target is justified, or they justify it to themselves by constructing some kind of moral violation that the target has committed. The phenomenon of context collapse means that groups with diametrically opposed values, say the far left or the far right, or Black Lives Matter protesters and Trump supporters, are visible to each other online. This visibility increases the likelihood that people with drastically different moral codes will encounter each other, causing moral outrage and increasing the likelihood of harassment. Now, whether or not you think a particular incident of harassment is justified is going to depend on your own moral standpoint. So you might think it's completely fine to harass a professor whose scholarship is racist, for example. But you might find it unacceptable if one of your colleagues is harassed for writing about critical race theory. And I think it's really important to remember that harassment is entwined with structural systems of misogyny, racism, anti-Semitism, homophobia, and transphobia, which determine the primary standards and norms by which people speaking in public are judged. And I want to really quickly go over one concept from the morally motivated networked harassment model, which is this idea of an attack vector. And I heard this term from one of my informants who was an IT professional, and it's slang in information technology or information security for a feature of a system that can be exploited. So it's a system vulnerability. So in this context, for example, while a Black professor might be harassed over his comments about anything, his Blackness will frequently become an attack vector. That means he will face racist abuse and slurs regardless of what he's being criticized for. But his status as a man is generally not an attack vector. He's generally not going to be subject to harassment based on his gender. But the point is that harassment, the process of harassment is the same, and people engage in it for the same reasons. But networked harassment of academics is particularly encouraged by a number of watchdog groups who have taken up the idea that universities discriminate against conservative students or spread radical liberal beliefs. Conservative groups maintain websites like this one, the Professor Watch List, which is maintained by Turning Point USA, which is a conservative college campus group. And they focus on perceived discrimination against white people and conservative students. Groups like Film Your Marxist Professor encourage students to film lectures using their mobile phones and put them online for critique. And the wildly popular conservative former professor Jordan Peterson called for students to target Marxist classes in gender studies, ethnic studies, sociology, anthropology, English literature, and education, labeling them indoctrination cults. Professors who fall afoul of these sites are often subject to networked harassment on social media, in which they are bombarded with abuse and threats. And across disciplines and professions, when we look at who the targets of networked harassment are, they're disproportionately women, queer folks, non-binary folks, and people of color. So we know that the effects of harassment are myriad: depression, anxiety, stress, suicidal ideation, self-harm, and increased fear. Other people have lost their jobs or their socioeconomic status, their relationships, and professional opportunities due to harassment. But the primary impact of online harassment is exactly what is intended by its perpetrators: to decrease the target's participation in the public sphere. Just as street harassment serves to discourage women's use of public space, fear of network harassment may have a chilling effect that is threefold. It discourages vulnerable scholars from engaging in public scholarship, it dissuades scholars from pursuing certain research topics, and it diminishes the ability of individual scholars to conduct important work. And one of the things that I would really like to see is a more systemic effort from colleges and universities to support their faculty, their grad students, their postdocs, their adjuncts, if they fall afoul of these kinds of things. There needs to be like a plan in place. Ideally, universities would have somebody who's sort of an expert in dealing with this. In practice, there's a few of us working on this, but we've seen very little adoption. But we're in the kind of early stages. So let's turn to the other side, the publicity side of it. What about courting publicity? Aren't there instances in which we want attention online? So self-branding, or the idea that you deliberately create and manage a public identity and self-presentation to further your strategic goals, is a very common, if somewhat threadbare, element of modern career advice. And the idea is that by having this strong self-brand, you'll stand out in a crowded marketplace. And in academia, where we kind of operate as these independent entities whose careers are somewhat separate from whatever institution we're currently working for, opportunities like jobs, talks, and workshop invitations are often extended through professional networks. And I think a lot of these connections are often made on social media. Informal bantering on Twitter, Slack, or Discord, or advice seeking on popular Facebook groups can build connections and friendships, support networks, and collaborations. And I generally think I generally think self-branding is a bunch of hooey. I think it encourages people to see themselves as products. I think it encourages a lot of surface over substance. But I do think that a strong social media presence can help people in some cases, especially when it comes to building social capital online. But what does this mean? What is a strong social media presence? If you have a very basic Twitter account where you're just like, here's my new publication, here's a CFP, it's probably going to be kind of boring and nobody will probably read it. The delicate balance of being good at social media without falling afoul of professional norms is really tricky. And as I said, I am a big social media person. I've used Twitter a lot. I'm also tenured. I'm doing just fine. I still have to constantly check myself. Like, am I tweeting too much about silly things I like pop music or RuPaul's Drag Race or whatever? Do I not sound like a serious person? And I think that social media does reward self-presentation that comes off as authentic, rather than what seems heavily managed or edited. But what's authentic is itself a performance. And successful online celebrities are very careful not to reveal things that puncture their public image. So the anthropologist Crystal Abaddon, whose work is terrific, distinguishes between what she calls anchor content and filler content on social media. So say you're like a food blogger, your food blog might be your anchor content, but you might have this filler content that's like places on your Instagram stories where you take people behind the scenes and you kind of show them little snippets of your life. But that's just as carefully calibrated to seem spontaneous and authentic as your anchor content is. And this shows that you can't just be authentic online. You have to perform an authenticity that fits within the norms of your community, which probably is going to mean that you tamp down any self-expression that seems unprofessional. And the ability to court this right kind of attention requires a set of skills that is far from what is taught in graduate school. All right, I'm almost done here. Generally, academic norms privilege upper middle class self-presentation, scholarly language, and research skills. But the norms of your profession can be different from the norms of your subfield or your department or your university. And having to navigate these all at the same time is very difficult. And the further these norms are from your community of origin, the more difficult they are to traverse. The difficulties that, say, scholars from low-income backgrounds or scholars of color face throughout the academy are well chronicled. But social media makes this code switching as multiple audiences are collapsed very difficult. So for example, an African-American faculty member who engages with the humor and activism that's ubiquitous on Black Twitter might use language or imagery on social media that resonates with their own life experience, but is alien to their white coworkers or to their university administration. They may also be more vulnerable when engaging in larger scale public scholarship, since, as my colleague Tressie McMillan-Cottom again says, claims to expertise that come from marginalized people often meet heavy resistance. Returning to networked privacy, privacy work is unequally distributed. Scholars from diverse backgrounds may feel that they have to heavily self-censor online in order to be palatable to a professional audience or to avoid harassment, thus infringing on the possibility of this authentic public engagement. This is especially true for young scholars who may worry that a lively social media presence will put off a conservative search committee or lead to possible retaliation. And this is a legitimate worry given these kind of high profile incidences in which professors have been disciplined or job offers rescinded for fiery remarks about the NRA, the Republican Party, or Israel. Thus, many of us find ourselves in this visibility trap in which this strong push to communicate publicly exists alongside the equally strong possibilities of backlash, harassment, and negative effects, which, as I've said, is deeply acute for people of color, women, queer and non-binary folks, and other vulnerable populations. A blanket exhortation to engage in public scholarship or even social media engagement without acknowledging this unequal distribution of risk is frankly, I think, irresponsible. So to conclude, as we think about how social media and network technologies have transformed attention, we must understand that these impacts, as I've said several times now, are unequally distributed. Privacy and publicity are wrapped up in complicated intersectional power relationships, and managing this transformation of attention is an unequal burden. And I really think at this point that we have to look beyond technology companies and the government to solve these problems, because after years spent talking to tech companies and talking to people who do policy work on tech, there's just not a lot coming. So what can we actually do? And I think we have to interrogate our own presuppositions and actions. So since I started studying harassment, I've really tried not to drag people on social, even if it's people who I think did something really horrible, even if everyone else in my professional network is doing it. Even if I think it's justified, even if I'm just quoting a tweet and giving my 2 cents. I've really tried to stop doing that because I think overall that dynamic is really bad. If we wish there wasn't so much judgment about social media presences, we should probably stop judging other people's social media presences, or at least speak up if someone on a search committee, for example, is complaining about something they saw on a candidate's profile. Technology is always changing faster than our norms and values. And I think when in doubt, we should be kind to each other. Thank you.
I'm trying to formulate a question out of my notes, which are very dispersed, and I need to think about it some more, but thanks for an excellent presentation. So the last part of your talk, especially about the academics, reminded me of being at a conference once and having a discussion with the other members of the conference. And most of them were on Twitter and I wasn't. And they were saying like, okay, often I get into fights on Twitter with people who have bad ideology, basically, misogynists, alt-right kind of people. And you enter into a fight and basically it's kind of like a service that you're providing for your university for free. You're defending like better opinions in a way. So I thought it was a very weird form of free labor that was emerging then a while ago. And your talk made me think about different things, like theories of the attention economy often phrase, say that attention becomes currency, that it becomes monetized. But I'm thinking it's so much more than just monetized. It's not just like capitalist value, but it also has, there is something like attention capital, there is something like celebrity capital possibly that goes into it, maybe even intellectual capital, or like another symbolic kind of capital that we still need to define for these days. And all these things are working against each other or with each other at the same time, I would say. And it seems like a whole lot of different roles that one should balance to enter into that arena. And then you say it's a very risky business. It is something that's more risky for marginalized people than for white males, for instance. And all of that makes me think that it's a very hard thing to do, and you do not get this, this protection from your university. So where am I going with this? Yeah, I wonder, how could we better theorize this idea of a kind of public intellectual persona that do wants to like enter the public sphere in this day and age? So what kind of labor goes into it? Would there be a better way to theorize it so that institutions would be better prepared to actually protect people against harassment? I'm sorry if this is all over the place.
No, that's a great question. Thank you. So first of all, people in the digital humanities have been trying to get universities to accept public scholarship as a more legitimate form of scholarship for years. And there hasn't been a ton of progress on that front. So there's plenty of places where even if you did do a TED Talk where you got 1 million views or whatever, nobody's going to care about that if it's not in a top journal or it's not in a university published book. So I think the problem is there's not a ton of incentives, I think, to do a lot of public scholarship. So, you know, I think when I think of someone who I think is a great public scholar, I think of someone like Judith Butler. Now, Judith Butler's work is not very accessible. She's not bell hooks, right? She's not super readable. The average person isn't going to sit down with gender trouble and curl up with it at night. But if anyone read that interview she did in The Guardian last year about TERFs and transphobes, it was so good. It was so smart. She just cut through so much BS with her razor sharp intellect and really kind of laid down what the stakes are for trans people and how garbage all the anti-trans fake feminist gender critical movement stuff is. That to me was the kind of public scholarship that I want to be able to do, is to be able to use the way that I've thought about things in a complicated way to get ideas across to people that they wouldn't necessarily otherwise encounter. It's not about making my ego feel better, right? Yes, maybe you engage in public scholarship to do that, but on the other, ultimately what you want is to give people tools to help deal with the world, or you want your scholarship to have impact. So I think if you do want to do public scholarship, you have to think about what is the end game. And someone like Bell Hooks is obviously, again, I think the gold standard for this kind of stuff. Her writing is beautiful. It's super accessible. She writes in a lot of different styles, a lot of different intellectual idioms. She writes for the Black community, for the white community. It's she'll write in a different way depending on the audience that she's trying to reach. And that's really hard because most of us are taught to write very badly when we're in graduate school. So you have to unlearn a lot of that and start learning to write like a normal writer, a person who wants to be understood by others. And again, sometimes there's a sense that oh, well, if your work is easy to understand, it can't be that smart, right? If it's only smart if it's really complicated. So, you know, I think it's a bunch of different challenges, but I do think they're navigable. I have a really good book by Jesse Daniels and Arlene Stein wrote this book on being a public scholar from a feminist viewpoint. That's really cool. I'll see if I can find that and put it in the chat. So there is some guidelines out there, but like I said, it's a minefield. But I do think that ultimately, if you want your research to have an impact on the world, to me, I feel like I have a responsibility to do that kind of work.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Are we allowed one more?
One more question? Thank you so much for that. Hi. Thank you so much for that talk. My question actually has to do with the ethics around managing forms of privacy and publicity for junior scholars and vulnerable academics. I'm just going to use a concrete example from 10, 12 years of managing the Critical Code Studies Working Group with my colleague, Mark Marino. So early on, we were thinking, well, we have junior scholars and independent researchers writing on topics like indigenous programming languages, feminist programming languages, Black code studies. And this is, thinking back, 2014, 16, Gamergate was going on, Circassian was getting doxxed, and there were bomb threats when she tried to give talks. And we thought, well, we'll make the working group a private forum. So thinking kind of about some of the tactics Joe talks about for love of hate groups, right? You know, as you say, well, we'll go in there and it'll be a safe space. Everyone's registered and has an account, and then they can all share these ideas in a way that is non-vulnerable, right? And nobody's going to get dragged. But then we also realized that what we were doing simultaneously was they were not getting indexed. They were not getting backed up by archive.org, right? They were not getting retweeted. And so we were like, well, are we harming people? And that switching back and forth and balancing and then saying, well, we'll make it open, but the only people who can comment are people who can log in, has partly been about trying to balance that ethics of how to create a shared community, but then not being able to allow individual members to fine tune their privacy, because a joint conversation has to have joint rules, right? You can't, parts of it can't be secret and other parts not. So how might you recommend that communities or organizers, people who end up setting rules for others or for vulnerable people, approach these kinds of trade-offs?
That's a very good question. I don't know that I know the answer, but I could think of maybe a couple of different ways to think through it. The first would be to ask the people who are the most vulnerable what they would like to do, right? I think there's different people have different risk assessments. For example, like when I'm doing my far right work, like I have a bunch of research assistants, but I always have a bunch of different projects going on. So my grad students who work with me on the far right stuff, first of all, for that project, I only recruit students who are already doing work in hateful communities. They already have like familiarity with the subject matter. And then I always give them like other projects to do so that like they're not just stuck doing like horrible things. So I think that like, but that doesn't really answer your question about like the publicness and the ability to comment. So yeah, so first of all, I would say let's center the concerns of the vulnerable people themselves, see what it is that they want to do, because some of them might be more comfortable with taking on that risk for others than others. The second thing is and also some of them might be like, yeah, I really want to be a professional academic, so my citation counts are really important to me, where somebody else be like, well, I think I might go into industry or do something else, so that doesn't matter, right? So it might be different for different people. And the second thing I think would be to have some kind of, there's got to be a way to kind of proactively do an institutional response, even if it's just the response of your research group or the response of your department, for example. Like you can do stuff like you can educate your chair and the people in the department about what this looks like, make sure that if somebody calls looking for someone who's just like written a piece on something that might be a fiery issue, that their office number isn't given out over the phone. You know, there's like basic security stuff that you can do. But ultimately, I think this is the visibility trap, right? On one hand, we need to be visible to get credit for the kind of work that we do and to become known names and get jobs. On the other hand, that visibility opens us up to these difficult things. But I think ultimately what most of the people that I talked to who had experienced harassment wanted was they just wanted people to talk about it who understood, because a lot of the time when they underwent this, nobody would understand it. They'd be like, this is just people on Twitter bothering you. Like, just get off the internet. Just like, stop doing this stuff. Just don't use social media. And that's not helpful. It doesn't help anybody. It's like telling someone who was stalked, like, just don't go outside, right? That's not, that doesn't solve. So I think just keeping an open dialogue and letting people have these conversations and kind of going through it on a granular level and giving people the space to be like, hey, I'm scared about this, or I'm worried about this, and letting them talk about their experiences. One last thing, because I know we're running low on time, is that the thing that I heard from so many people was, I feel dumb that this upset me because it's just something on the internet. And so just saying to people that it's okay to be upset because someone said something mean to you on the internet, like that's a normal reaction to be upset. It's okay to feel bad. You don't have to feel silly or like you should be this like hard ass that doesn't let mean words affect you. Like that's not human. So allowing that vulnerability and recognizing it, I think is important. But thank you for that great question.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.